Hello, and welcome back to Huddersfield Local History Society's 2021-2022 season of online talks. I'm particularly pleased to introduce our first talk of this new season. Our speaker, Beverly Norris, is a retired nurse, a former graduate of Huddersfield Polytechnic. She holds an MSc in Health Professional Education, and she's a former lecturer in nursing studies at Bradford University. Retirement has given her the opportunity to pursue an interest in the life stories of working class women in the 19th century, in particular those involved in domestic service. Her essay on that subject of the domestic servants of the villas of Egerton here in Huddersfield won her the Huddersfield Local History Society Edward Law Prize this year. Beverly.
Over the last couple of years, I've been trying to find out about the women who lived and worked as servants in Egerton. Egerton is a leafy Victorian suburb of Huddersfield. It was home to many of the town's prominent citizens at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. The development of this suburb is the subject of David Griffith's book, The Villas of Egerton. The book tells the history of the villas with a focus upon their architecture and their wealthy occupants. Alan Brooke reviews the book on the Underground Histories website. Alan makes the point that the villas could not have functioned without the domestic workers, and that someone might want to investigate this side of the story. This seemed an ideal project for me, because I have an interest in working class history, and in particular the history of working class women, a much neglected group in the history books. David's work was very useful in that it gave me a framework for the research, particularly regarding which villas to include. As a starting point, I found any available census information for the villas included in David's book, and identified the resident servants. Doing this, I've collected information on almost 1,000 servants, and I've analysed the census data to gain an overall picture of the average Egerton servant. In addition, I've begun to track individual servants through time using earlier and later censuses and other records, such as those of births, deaths and marriages. So far, I've tracked about 90 servants this way, with varying degrees of success, but I found these individual stories are helping me to build fuller answers to the questions of who these women were and why they became servants in Egerton. I'm very pleased to be sharing with you some of what I've learnt so far. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Jane Cartwright. Jane was born at Mill Hill near Hepworth and Home Firth. I've highlighted Mill Hill in orange on this 1861 map. At the time of Jane's birth, most people in this area made a living from woolen textiles, but there was also agriculture and a number employed in coal mining. Jane's mother, Anne, married John Cartwright in September 1846. Jane was born in the last quarter of that year. John Cartwright was a farm labourer from Shaley in Wooldale. Shaley is between Wooldale and Scholes, about where I've put a blue highlight on the map, towards the centre and to the right of the word Home Firth. This is where the family settled. In the years that followed, the family grew until Jane had 5 siblings, 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Baptism records for her siblings confirm that the family were living at Shaley Wood Bottom. However, at the beginning of May 1860, Anne and John Cartwright were over 7 miles away from Shaley at Bradford Road in Huddersfield. I don't know why they were there or whether they had their children with them. In fact, the only reason I know they were there is because it's on their death certificates. 2 weeks after the birth of George, Anne Cartwright died of peritonitis. The infection had developed 4 days after she'd given birth to George. 6 days later, her husband John died of hepatitis of 14 days duration. Jane would have been 13. These tragic events left the children orphaned. The 1861 census tells us what happened to each of them. All Jane's younger siblings went to live with relatives who were all in the Home Firth area. Her sisters, Hannah, who was 12, and Anatha, 6, went to an aunt and uncle who lived in Shaley. 9-year-old Elizabeth and George, who was 11 months by this time, went to another aunt and uncle at Hayde Edge. Joe, who was just 3, was taken in by a recently married cousin who lived at Tenter Hill. Subsequent census records show that they stayed with their allotted families until they were adults, and in at least 3 cases they were with them well into their 30s, which suggests these were successful adoptions. That was her siblings. So where was Jane when the 1861 census was taken? Jane was 14 and still living in the Home Firth area, but she was a servant to a 73-year-old widow who was a farmer. They were living together at Stake Lane, within a mile of where Jane was brought up. It seems her employer had lived most of her life at Stake Lane. She'd been widowed twice and raised at least 7 children, and looking at previous census records as well as that of 1861, it appears there was always some of her family members living close by, so it can be hoped there would have been help with the farming duties, but it's likely Jane would have had some involvement, as well as caring for the house and her employer, who died 3 years later in 1864. The next source of information I have about Jane is from the census of 1871. By this time, Jane had moved 8 miles from Home Firth to Thornhill Road, Edgerton, and begun working as a servant to a family who lived in a villa called Springfield. The head of the household was a successful woolen merchant. Springfield was built about 1863, so it is possible that Jane went from her employment in Wooldale directly to her job in Edgerton. Jane had a long career with one family at Springfield and appears on each of their census returns from 1871 to 1911 when she was 64. This table shows what was written about Jane in each census. You can see that whilst she's always identified as a servant, her listed occupation varies, and in 1891 and 1911 the roles of the servants in residence at Springfield were not specified. The information about where she was born varies in detail. The more specific information helped me to identify her family because Cartwright was a common name in the Home Firth area. Jane was always one of 3 servants listed as resident, apart from in 1881 when there were 4. There would have been other servants, such as a gardener or a coachman, but it was usual for these to live in separate accommodation nearby, often with their own family. Of the resident servants at Springfield, Jane was by far the oldest in all but the 1871 census. The other servants changed with each census, with the exception of a cook called Elizabeth Abel, who appears in both the 1901 and 1911 census. This is Springfield, the house Jane would have kept clean and warm, and where she would have served the family and their guests, who she would have greeted at that impressive front door. These villas were built to impress. Their well-to-do occupants were part of a growing middle class, and the employment of servants, as well as being a practical necessity, was part of demonstrating wealth and status. Jane would probably have worn a uniform and followed strict protocols for welcoming guests and serving meals. The middle classes set great store by such things and tried to emulate the homes and traditions of the landed gentry. In addition to looking the part, Jane would have worked very hard over long hours. Maintaining these houses was hard graft. It was physically demanding and required a whole range of skills. Much of this information I've gained from reading servant memoirs or contemporary guides to service and household management, as well as more recent literature on servant history. It seems in Britain, those who could afford labour-saving devices were slow to adopt them compared to their European and American counterparts. So by the 20th century, the work was often unnecessarily hard. Having central heating or gas cookers fitted was not seen as a priority when there was a housemaid to carry the coal. They were also reluctant to dispense with chamber pots, even when they had indoor toilets. The villas of Egerton were built to accommodate resident servants. They usually used different stairways and different outside doors from the families they served, and attic bedrooms were the norm. It's difficult to know how much Jane would have seen of her own family during these years. Servants didn't have much time off, and if they did, it was often just part of a day rather than a whole day, and the journey from Egerton to Holmfirth would have taken much longer than it does now. Jane was a witness at her sister Anatha's wedding at Holmfirth Parish Church in 1888. The evidence from the certificate of this wedding and that of her sister Hannah's in 1884 indicate that Jane was the only one of the three who could sign her name. Both Hannah and Anatha used a cross as their mark. When they started work, Jane's siblings had all gone into textile jobs, apart from Joe, who became a coal miner, following in the footsteps of his adoptive father. Jane's mistress at Springfield died in May 1914 at the age of 90, when Jane was 67. The family sold the house the following year, and Jane lived for a time on Clarice Terrace in nearby Linley, but died in the lodge of Springfield on the 12th of December 1920. She was 74. At the time of Jane's death, the lodge was the residence of the gardener and his wife. Jane's story is not typical of the Egerton servants I've studied for two main reasons. The first being her birthplace. Jane was born in the Huddersfield area, which was not true of most Egerton servants. I'll come back to where they did come from later. The second difference is the number of census records in which Jane is listed as a servant in Egerton. Which brings me on to the subject of numbers, and I would just like to explain the basis of the statistics I will provide in this talk. As I said earlier, I used David Griffith's book to identify which villas I researched. So when I say Egerton villas, I'm referring to those included in David's book. The statistics come from the entries on resident servants that were made on each census from 1841 through to 1911. So that includes 7 censuses over a 70-year time period. When I added up all the resident servants listed, it came to 981. But because 36 of those servants appear on more than one census, it means the total number of individual servants included in this study is 937. Jane was the only servant to appear on 5 census returns. The vast majority, over 96%, appeared in only one. And as you can see from the few that were on more than one, most were on just 2. And those who were on more than one nearly all appeared on consecutive censuses, which suggests they were employed throughout the decade in between. An exception to that was Margaret Cartwright, no relation to Jane as far as I can tell, who was employed at Oakwood on Hungerford Road. Margaret was employed as a waiting maid in 1891 and then as a housemaid in 1911. However, the 1901 census in between shows Margaret was at her birthplace in Ellington in North Yorkshire, staying with her father. No information is given about her employment, but it may be that this was just a visit and Margaret was still employed at Oakwood. This demonstrates a limitation of using just census data to build up a picture of servant employment practices. It doesn't tell us exactly how long servants worked for an employer. But it does show that most servants worked there for less than a decade, and it seems likely there would have been a lot of others employed between censuses, which means the number of resident servants employed in Egerton between 1841 and 1911 would have been much higher than 937. Of the 36 that were on more than one census, they were all continuing to work for the same employer. Like Jane and Margaret, they were usually at the same villa, unless they moved with their employer from one villa to another. It seems that servants did not change employers within the Egerton area. The work servants performed meant they were privy to very personal information about their employers, and it's unlikely employers would want to risk sharing this information with their neighbours by swapping servants. So they may have had an unwritten code that it was not the done thing to employ their neighbour's servant. This table shows how many of the servants were from Huddersfield or from Yorkshire. The first column shows the year of the census and the second shows the number of villas included in the research. The numbers vary because most of the villas were not built until the 1860s, which is why the numbers increased dramatically between 1861 and 1871. They also vary because some villas were unoccupied at the time of a census. Next, we have the number of servants, and then we have the number and percentage whose census record indicates they were born in the Huddersfield area. The 1841 census only states whether an individual was born in the county, so I don't have a number for that year. In other years, it doesn't usually say Huddersfield, but rather the name of the village or area, such as Lepton or Lockwood. The definition of what is deemed to be Huddersfield has changed over the years, so for the purposes of this study I have defined it as anywhere that would now have a Huddersfield HD postcode that falls within the Kirklees Council area. You can see that most servants didn't come from Huddersfield, and there was a tendency for the percentage to become smaller as the years progressed. It's thought that employers preferred to have servants from outside the local area, but there is another important factor to consider here. Women in Huddersfield who needed employment had other options available to them. The 1901 census showed that more than half of employed females over 10 years of age in Huddersfield worked in textiles. Only 17% were servants, and that would include the women who had moved to Huddersfield specifically for that job. Nationally, the percentage in service was much greater, at over 40%. There would have been some from Huddersfield employed elsewhere as servants, of course, but it's unlikely their number would undermine the dominance of textiles for employing Huddersfield-born women and girls. Looking at the final column on the right, you can see that the number of servants who came from Yorkshire is much larger, but once again there is a tendency for the percentage to reduce over time. Many came from villages or market towns in North, East or South Yorkshire. The growth in the passenger rail network in the latter half of the 1800s would have made it easier for servants to get to Huddersfield from more remote places. Most servants were born in England, but there were a handful from other countries on each census. This slide shows which countries the servants came from in 1871. The largest section represents 137 who were born in England. The smaller sections show there were 3 servants from Germany, 3 from Scotland, 2 from Wales, 1 from Switzerland and 1 from Ireland. The proportion of servants from other countries was about the same on each of the censuses, and most of them were from Scotland, Wales and Ireland. Here we can see a little more detail about the 3 German servants who appeared on the 1871 census. As you can see, they were employed in different houses, the Grange, Bankfield and Clyde House, but in each case the head of the household was also German by birth. These were the homes of 3 successful woolen merchants who had settled in Huddersfield. If you'd like to know more about them or any of the other wealthy residents, I recommend the Villas of Egerton book by David Griffiths. This shows the different counties the servants came from in the same year, 1871. You can see that most came from Yorkshire. The second largest group are those not from England discussed in the previous 2 slides. After that, Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Lancashire are the best represented counties, and then servants came in their 1s and 2s from the other counties listed on the right, from as far north as Northumberland and as far south as Devon. I took a closer look at the households employing servants from Norfolk and found that 6 of them were employed in just 2 houses, namely Granham Lodge and Ashlee, and in both cases the head of the household was a Huddersfield-born woolen merchant who had married a woman from Norfolk, which probably explains the number of servants from that county. In comparison, here we can see the birth counties of servants 30 years later in 1901. The number from Yorkshire, while still the largest group, has reduced to half the total, and by far the best represented of the other counties is Lincolnshire. This time only 1 came from Norfolk. The 22 servants from Lincolnshire were scattered throughout the villas and their employers did not come from Lincolnshire, so it seems more likely that the higher number is due to the rural nature of the county, along with it being a neighbour of Yorkshire. It has been suggested that employers preferred servants from rural areas as they thought they would be less worldly and more biddable. This may be true, but it is likely that alternative employment options, or a lack of them, was and still is a more significant factor in creating a pool of servants from a particular location. With that in mind, I'd like to share with you the stories of 2 women who were servants at the Gables in 1939. As I've already explained, most of my research is rooted in the data from the accessible Egerton census records, the last one being from 1911, but I have gained some information from the 1939 register taken at the onset of World War II. Some entries on the register are redacted because the individual might still be living, and that makes the data incomplete, so I haven't used it in the statistics. Also, it's more difficult to identify the villas because by 1939 the nature of occupancy had begun to change. However, some were still being used as originally intended, that is, occupied by 1 family and their servants, and this was the case at the Gables. The head of the household was a woolen manufacturer, and the servants listed there were Regina and Lena Rathsprecher. Regina was 23 and the cook, and 20-year-old Lena was the housemaid. The 1939 register doesn't record information on birthplace, but it does provide an exact date of birth and occupation, and I used this information to find other records relating to these 2 women. The records I found poured light on why they were servants. I found evidence that they'd been born in Vienna, which at the time of their birth had been in Austria, but in 1938 had been incorporated into Nazi Germany. These women were Jewish and had arrived in England as refugees. By this time in Britain, employment options for working class women had become more varied and women with other options usually took them. This led to a situation whereby the demand for servants outstripped the supply. So, as one method of trying to address this situation, the British authorities allowed refugees to enter the country if they would work in domestic service. It's been estimated that 20,000 Jewish people, mainly young women, fled to England to take work as domestic servants in 1938 and 1939, when the border was closed and this method of escape ceased to exist. Having connections abroad and the resources to cope with the difficult paperwork increased a person's chances of being able to escape via this method, which meant many of those who did so had come from well-to-do families. This appears to have been the case for Regina and Lena. Here is some information about the Rathsprechers and where they were in 1939. Berish Rathsprecher had been a manufacturer of knitted goods back in Austria, which had probably given him useful contacts in Britain. When the 1939 register was taken, Berish was residing with a Jewish family in London. His wife, Esther, had been a housewife in Austria, but in 1939 Esther was working as a cook for a household in Salcombe, Devon. The same house employed Elias as a handyman. Elias had been an architect in Austria. Hermann Rathsprecher had sailed from Brussels to New York in December 1939 to live with an uncle, and he was drafted into the US Army the following year. Otto, just 18 years old, was in Brussels in 1939. Later he was in a French internment camp. Eventually he also made the journey to his uncle's in New York in January 1942, where he registered for the draft the following month. These were the circumstances which resulted in the sisters becoming servants in Egerton. The quote is from an article which is based upon the testimonies of 250 former Jewish refugee domestics. It's freely available online, and I've included the link if you're interested to know more about this aspect of British history. The scheme saved thousands of women's lives, but only if they accepted servitude. From these testimonies, it seems that in most cases their traumatic circumstances were of little or no interest to their employers. They were treated like any other servant, and so the memories of these women do shed light upon the life of a resident servant in Britain in 1939, and that it was not as cosy as it can appear in popular television dramas. Employers varied, of course. But for most of these women, life was hard, and sadly, abuse was not rare. Let's hope Regina and Lena had one of the better employers. Lena went on to marry a fellow refugee who'd been interned at the Kitchener camp in Kent. They married in 1947 in Huddersfield. It appears they spent some time as caretakers of a multiple occupancy house in Kensington, before following other family members to New York in 1951. They made a home for themselves in the States and eventually became US citizens. Lena died in New York in 2001 at the age of 82. Regina married a British man in 1942 and became a British citizen herself. It seems when Lena went to the US, Regina and her husband took over as caretakers at the residence in Kensington, before making a home for themselves in Surrey. They stayed there for a couple of decades, then moved to the village of Lansing on the coast of West Sussex, where Regina died in 2002, aged 86. I'd like to take you back again to those Egerton servants who appear on available census records. Here are some characteristics of the average servant. These characteristics reflect the situation in each individual census year as well as over the whole time period. Most of these resident servants were women. Less than 2.5% were men. As I mentioned earlier, men were employed, particularly in roles such as gardeners or coachmen, or by 1911, rather than coachmen, some were chauffeurs. But these men usually lived with their own families in separate accommodation. Sometimes this may have been a property on the grounds, such as the lodge at Springfield, but they also lived in modest terraced housing in nearby places like Marsh, Lindley or Birkby. 96% of the resident servants were single, 3% were widowed and only 1% were married. Some of those married servants were male gardeners, such as John Edgar Foster, who was a gardener at Thornhill Villa in 1911. His wife Mary was the other resident servant. The average age of the servants was 27. By far the youngest was 10-year-old Martha Appleyard, who was a servant at Woodside in 1871. Martha was the only servant listed. The other residents were a woolen salesman, his wife and adult daughter. The next youngest Egerton servant was 13. Then there were 3 who were 14, but all the others were 15 or over, and most servants were in their 20s and 30s. The research I've done into the life stories of some of the servants shows that it wasn't usually their first job, and they were already experienced servants by the time they took jobs in Egerton. The oldest servants were both 66. Sarah Helen Howarth, a lady's help at Sunnybank, and Isabella McLean Winning, housekeeper at Westmount. In both cases they were listed along with another younger servant. Also resident at Sunnybank were a land surveyor and his wife. The couple were both in their 50s and the mistress was born in Haywood, Lancashire, about 6 miles from Ratcliffe, where Sarah was born. At Westmount, Isabella and Ada were the only residents listed. Their employer must have been away from home at the time of the census. Back to the average servant. As I've already covered, most were not from Huddersfield. It appears that most had first gone into service a bit closer to where they were born and brought their experience to Egerton, where they worked for a few years, but not enough to appear in more than one census. During their time in Egerton, most were one of 2 or 3 servants. The highest number of resident servants listed in Egerton were at Stone Lea. Here, 9 servants were listed in both 1891 and 1901. The same woolen manufacturer and his family were in residence in each census. The fact that the youngest children were growing up is reflected in there being no nurses employed in 1901. There were still 3 housemaids, a cook and a kitchen maid, but none of them were the same people. It's a completely different set of servants. None of them were from Huddersfield, only 3 were from Yorkshire. In 1891, housemaid Alice Wilson was from York and nurse Martha Ray was from Barnsley. Then in 1901, the cook Clarissa Webster was from East Ardsley. The employment of male servants in the form of a butler and footman is a real indication that it was important to this family to demonstrate their wealth and emulate the landed gentry, in whose households the more expensive male indoor servants were more likely to be found. With each census, I identified the servants by using the section which states the relationship of an occupant to the head of the household. But I also used the section providing information on occupation, and this is where I found more detail about individual roles. In this chart, I've tried to present information about the numbers for the different job titles listed, covering the whole period from 1841 to 1911. Not all those supplying census information differentiated between their servants, and so a sizable number, just less than a quarter, used generic terms for all those listed. On the chart, these are represented by the 3rd tallest column, labelled General, Domestic, Servant, Maid, or FS for female servant, and MS for male servant. Those initials were used only in the 1841 census. A small number left this section blank, but most did specify a servant role. The largest number were the housemaids, closely followed by the cooks, and between them they accounted for just over half of the servants. It seems the priorities of the employers were to be kept clean, warm and fed. Most households had a housemaid and a cook, but there was some variety regarding additional servants, reflecting the different organisation of households and sometimes perhaps the desire to impress. I've grouped some of these additional roles, which might have different names but cover similar duties, such as a parlour maid, waiting maid or serving maid. I've also grouped those with nurse in the title, but in this case the work done might be quite different. The title of nurse was used for those who cared for small children, as well as those who cared for the sick. The ages of the families occupying these villas has led me to believe that most of the nurses in Egerton were involved in childcare, but this is a subject I'd like to investigate further. As I come towards the end of this talk, I'd like to go back to 1871 and to Springfield, and I'd like to share with you the story of Emily Webb, who was the cook. Like several other servants whose lives I've tracked, Emily had experienced hard times in early life. She was born in the village of Maxey near Peterborough. She was baptised at the church in Maxey, and on the baptism record it states that she was the illegitimate daughter of Sarah Webb. The 1851 census lists both Emily and her mother as paupers and inmates of the Peterborough Union Workhouse. Emily was 5 years of age. Her mother Sarah was 25, and Sarah's listed occupation was house servant. 10 years earlier, Sarah had been a 15-year-old farm servant in a village nearby Maxey. I don't know what happened to Sarah after 1851. Her name is recorded identifying her as Emily's mother on a later document relating to Emily, but I've not been able to trace Sarah. By the time Emily was 15, she was a servant herself at the residence of a butcher. The butcher's wife was a milliner and dressmaker. They lived in the centre of the market town of Stamford in Lincolnshire, about 8 miles from Maxey. Local trade directories show that her employers carried out their trades from this place of residence. Amidst the inevitable hard work of being the only servant in such a busy household, Emily probably learnt skills she was able to use throughout her life. For example, an understanding of butchery and the food preferences of wealthy customers would have been a huge advantage when ordering and preparing food for her employer's family and their guests at Springfield. But being a servant in Egerton would have been very different from this earlier experience. In Stamford, her mistress earned a living, and Emily would have been part of a working household. In wealthier homes, such as those in Egerton, the aim was for the mistresses to oversee domestic arrangements, but not to do any work themselves. Like most servants, Emily only appears on one Egerton census, and in 1874 she was back in Lincolnshire, where she married a shepherd 8 years her junior. The following year Emily became a mother, and by 1888 she had 2 boys and 3 girls. But in addition to raising a family, Emily was earning a living. The 1891 census lists Emily as a grocer, while her husband by then was a butcher. They were still practising these trades in 1911 when Emily was 65. Elizabeth Marshall, the serving maid at Springfield in 1871, had previously lived with an aunt who was a grocer, and after her time at Springfield, Elizabeth went on to become a lodging housekeeper in Scarborough. The lodging house accommodated a small number of guests, including musicians, probably employed in entertaining visitors to the resort. Tracking the lives of Egerton servants shows that no two were the same, but some potential trends have started to emerge that merit further investigation. An example of this might be seen in women like Emily and Elizabeth, who continued to earn a living after Egerton, but on their own account, rather than for an employer. The links between the workhouse and the servants is another interesting theme, particularly since in 1901 at Crossland Moor Workhouse, the largest in Huddersfield, over 75% of the female inmates had domestic servant identified as their occupation. The information I've gained from the Egerton census data has provided an overview of the employment of servants, and tracking a few of their lives has given some depth to that overall picture. As I continue with this research, I hope to gain more understanding about their experiences before, during and after their time in Egerton. I want to understand what impact their time in Huddersfield had upon them, and the impact they made upon Huddersfield. I'm particularly interested in gaining the perspective of the servants themselves, if that is possible. So if someone listening has any information about anyone who worked as a servant in Egerton, or has some knowledge of any of the houses that would be relevant to the servants who worked there, I would love to hear from you. At the end, Cyril will provide information about how you can make contact. That's all for now from Leafy Egerton. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Beverly. Family historians will know that many of us have stories of domestic service in our own family trees. It's certainly true of my own family. If you have, and you would like to share these stories with Beverly, then simply go to our Huddersfield Local History Society website, look up the contacts page, and there you will find a way of sending your information or making contact with the Society, and we will guarantee to send those contacts on to Beverly herself. She's hoping, I know, to build on the work of her studies of Egerton with further, more extensive studies, perhaps with a book in mind for the future. Thank you very much to all for watching, and thank you very much to Beverly. Until next time.